Welcome back to where we are working through the tasks for completing assignment 3 of PBL 2, the technical brief parts 1 through 3. As we left off in our last video, we completed task number 1, where we had to watch the Setting the Stage with Your Challenge Champion video and answering 2 questions. I've highlighted that green because we completed that. Here are the answers to my 2 questions, and now I'm going to move on to task number 2, where I have to read this article, Why People Are Falling in Love with Ugly Foods, and consider how the ugly food movement impacts trends. So again, I'm keeping track of the completion of all of my assignments here in this document so that I can show my teacher my progress. In order to access the article, I have to go back to the PBL 2 document, and on page 6, that is where I access the link for the article, Why People Are Falling in Love with Ugly Food. So if I click it, it'll bring up a hyperlink here, and this is the article that I have to read. Now, I can read this on this website, but it's not going to be helpful for me when I'm trying to recall information to answer questions for the technical brief or the project plan. So instead, I'm going to copy and paste this article into my document here so that I can take notes and keep track of what the document is about. It's going to require a little bit of work. I'm going to have to copy and paste parts individually and edit them, as you see me doing here. So I've copied and pasted the title. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to copy and paste the first few paragraphs. Okay, I'll go back and I'm going to paste it here. Notice I have to add the T to the beginning. So I have the beginning of the article. Now I'm going to go back to the article and pick up where I left off and copy and paste following that. I'm going to stop every time there's a break where there's like some big image that I don't want to copy and paste. That's where I just kind of stop. Then I'm going to add this to my document here, and then I'm going to go back and copy and paste the rest. And that is the entire article. So let me go back and paste that to my document here. So now I have copied and pasted the entire article so that I can keep track of what I'm reading about as I'm completing step 2. So it says, read the article and consider how the ugly food movement impacts food trends. So that's what I'm going to be paying attention to as I'm reading. So the article reads, the ugly food movement is taking off around the world, particularly in Europe and Australia, as an answer to the problem of food waste. So I see that, right, the ugly food movement is an answer. And I'm going to highlight as I'm reading, just so that I can keep track of different things that I come across in the text. So far, it has yet to firmly take hold in the United States, but given this country's love of solution-driven food trends, it seems a good bet that ugly food might soon take its place beside local food, organic food, and environmentally conscious eating. So right now, it's not really in the US, but it's looking to come here. And as a part of this project, we're going to be thinking about ways and ideas that we can create businesses to bring the movement to the US. It says, ugly foods are those that sellers and buyers often reject because of their appearance, like misshapen vegetables and bruised fruits. Farmers dump them, supermarkets and restaurants reject them, and consumers historically have avoided them. So this is important. This defines what ugly foods are. Okay. So this lets me know why. Sellers and buyers often reject them for these reasons. Okay. The problem of food waste is no joke. By some estimates, a third or more of the food produced globally goes uneaten. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight because that's an important fact. 1/3 or more goes uneaten. The costs are in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So that's how much we're wasting, hundreds of billions of dollars. Marketing so-called ugly food is one answer to the problem. So this is what our project is going to be about, right? How are we going to market so-called ugly food? Until recently, the European Union had rules actually preventing the sale of oddly sized or misshapen produce. So there were rules against this, right, where you couldn't sell things that were oddly sized or misshapen. So if it didn't look perfect, you couldn't sell it. But now those rules are gone because some of the rules were hilariously granular. A spear of asparagus could not be sold unless at least 80% of its length was green. The curve of cucumbers was regulated down to the millimeter. So they were just being really picky about what they wanted their food to look like in order for it to be sold, which meant that a lot of food probably went to waste. As part of a massive effort to reduce waste, 2014 was formally designated the European Year Against Food Waste. Most of those rules were scrapped a few years ago. Now, grocers, they are actively marketing such products, and apparently people are buying them, though it's hard to tell at this point how successful the efforts have been. Despite the popular name of the movement, marketers generally aren't using the word ugly. So that's important because ugly is not a word that catches people's attention. More artful terms are favored. A French supermarket chain is selling inglorious foods. So that just means that they're not glorious. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight this because this is important. When I get ready to think about my business, what words do I want to use? Do I want to use the word ugly or do I want to use a different word? The British chain ASDA uses wonky. So these are just some ideas for what other people are using. Inglorious, wonky, which to American ears might sound as bad as ugly. Canada's Loblaws uses naturally imperfect. So this is another example of a word choice that you can use when marketing. Celebrity chief Jamie Oliver, who has cast himself as a promoter of the good food movement, has signed on with some British chains to support their efforts. So I'm going to make a note because this is going to help me when I'm designing my business, right? The words I use to describe and market ugly foods are important to consumers. So I will choose my words carefully. So that's just a note for me as I'm reading. Other chains are approaching warily. Tesco, the biggest British grocer, sells its wonky foods in parts of Europe, but so far hasn't marketed them in its home country because it says British shoppers aren't ready for them. But the company has called for a public education campaign to get consumers on board. So it looks like in Britain, they're looking to educate their public on foods that are less than perfect, right? To get people to buy them. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that because that's important too. A lot of times when people don't know about something, they're less likely to participate in it. So here I'm going to make a note, right? It's important to teach people that ugly foods are still safe to eat, which will encourage people to buy them. So that way, when people are educated about something, they're more likely to participate in it. The trend is growing in Australia too, thanks in part to Oliver's efforts, though several chains there have been somewhat hesitant as well. While the movement is unquestionably gaining ground, getting the mainstream on board remains a serious challenge. Consumers in developed countries have been conditioned over decades to expect perfect looking produce. So this is one of the problems, right? We like our food to look pretty. In pictures, it looks pretty. On the magazines, on advertisements, it's always perfect. The apples are always bright red. The oranges are always yellow, orange. Everything always looks perfect. Everything is always shaped perfectly. It's always like polished. It looks immaculate. And so we're having a problem accepting food that looks less than that. So here it says, consumers in developed countries have been conditioned over decades to expect perfect looking produce. Generally, perfect means uniform and free of blemishes. Ugly foods are just as tasty and nutritious as their prettier counterparts. So one of the problems that we have to overcome is getting people to accept that even though this food doesn't look like the others, it still tastes just fine. It might take a long time to move people off those expectations. After all, the organic food movement began in earnest more than 40 years ago, but only in recent years has it started affecting the food business in a big way. Ugly food has a big advantage over organic food, though. It's generally cheaper than mainstream fare, rather than more expensive. So this is also important. Organic food is more expensive, whereas ugly food is less expensive. So we're going to make a note because people love to save money, right? When I go to the grocery store, I like to come out with a less grocery bill than a more expensive one. So I'm going to make a note that ugly food costs less. Than organic food and is more affordable. Okay. That doesn't hurt farmers or sellers one bit, though, since this is all food that would have ended up in the scrap bin. The revenues represent almost pure profit, and in fact, costs are actually reduced since the foods that once were rejected had to be shipped back to their source. The U.S., perhaps not surprisingly, has been slower than Europe to take up the trend, but there are some early indications that it might take off here. Bon Appetit Management, a big food service company owned by the gigantic Compass Group USA, last year launched Imperfectly Delicious Produce, a program to divert ugly foods from the waste stream to the restaurants and cafeterias the company serves. But such efforts are rare in the United States so far. Until recently, most ugly food that wasn't simply thrown away has been given to needy people. So here, right, until recently, most ugly food that wasn't simply thrown away has been given to needy people. So this is what we were originally doing with ugly foods. We were just giving it away, but now they're trying to figure out a way to sell it to individuals. Though efforts like the Food Recovery Network and the Environmental Protection Agency's Food Recovery Challenge and such efforts, of course, do help. But if the private sector can be moved to make ugly food not only saleable, but commercially popular, that will go a long way toward reducing the shocking amount of food we waste. So this article is basically telling me that the trends are increasing in the United States, that ugly food has the potential to save a lot of people money, and that we just have to work on changing the perception of how people think about ugly foods, right? If they can accept that an ugly food still tastes the same as a pretty looking food, then they might be more encouraged to buy it. And that is going to be impacted by the way that we describe the foods, right? Instead of calling them ugly, hey, do you want to buy this ugly banana? We can say something like, do you want to buy this naturally imperfect banana, right? The words that we use impact and influence how people feel about the food. So that's kind of what I learned about this article. Notice that I took notes. I'm going to be able to come back and refer to these notes once I get to the point where I'm ready to answer questions or parts 1 through 3 on the technical brief, because it talks about my solution, right, and how it solves the problem, and it talks about the decisions I made to design in my design. So that's where I'm going to bring information from this article back to answer questions in the brief. So now I have successfully completed step number 2 in my project plan, so I can cross this one off my list by highlighting it. And in my next video,